The mic is on. Oh, okay. We're good. Everybody can hear in the back. Is it too loud? Perfect. If I could just ask of you to please put your cell phones on vibrate, we would appreciate it. Okay, I'm just getting some things. Mamish, one moment. One moment. Good morning, everybody. Good. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this beautiful, warm morning. And happy Chodesh Elul to you. A good year, a good gebencht year to you and your families. A Shana Tova M'sukkah and a Ksiva V'chsima Tova to all of you and your loved ones. B'toich Klal Yisrael. I want to learn with you this morning. You can't hear? Okay. Maybe we'll raise the volume a little bit. Not too much, but just a little bit. If I could also just ask of you to please, if you didn't yet, put your cell phone on vibrate or on airplane mode. Put your cell phone on vibrate or on airplane mode. Okay, is it better? Now you can hear clear? Beseder? Tov mod. I want to learn with you this morning a halacha, a law from the Gemara. It's in Tractate Sanhedrin, Mesechus Sanhedrin, Daf Yud Zayin Amar Aleph, page 17a. I'm going to read it in the original and translate it. Amar Rav Kahana. One of the greatest Talmudic sages was a man named Rabbi Kahana. Rav Kahana said, Sanhedrin shera'u kulam l'choiva, poitrin oisai. If you have a Sanhedrin, a Supreme Court, and all of them unanimously deem the person who comes to court guilty, poitrin oisai, this person is exempt. This person is exonerated, he's acquitted. My timer, what is the reason? Kivin de gemiri halonas din, the reason is, whenever they were trying somebody in a case and there was no side for merit, nobody was standing up to the defense of the defendant, so what happens is they sleep on it, as we say in English. They delay the verdict to the next day, so that the judges can deliberate over the night to perhaps find a meritorious angle in order to acquit this person. But in this case, Sulay Chazile, nobody is finding any merit for him, and thus Reb Kahana says this person is exempt. Now let me explain the technicalities of what this halacha says. The way the Jewish nation was set up, it's articulated in the opening verse of Parshas Shoftim, Shoftim v'shoitrim, titin lecha b'chol, sha'arecha sha'Hashem Elokecha noisen lech. In all your cities, in all the cities of the Holy Land, there had to be they appointed Shoftim. They appointed judges, courts, in order to be able to deal with various disputes that come up, and in order to deal with various situations that come up, including, of course, criminals of all different types of sorts. The members of this court, the court was known as a Sanhedrin. There was the Sanhedrin Gedola, which means the central and the largest court of the Jewish people that was located in Yerushalayim, in the Beis HaMikdash, called the Sanhedrin Gedola, and that numbered 71. There were 71 members. The numbers, of course, always had to be odd, not even, so that if there was a vote, they could follow the majority. If not, you can have stalemate, because if it would be 70, and you have 35 against 35, so you don't know what to do. The Torah says, Achir Rabbim Lahatis, you follow the majority. So therefore, the number always had to be odd, not even. But there was a smaller court of 23 members, not 71 members, which was the Supreme Court of the Jewish people, but courts that were smaller in each city and each tribe that numbered 23. No court was allowed to try capital cases, which means give death penalties, if they were less than 23. There were smaller courts of 3, but those can be for monetary situations, monetary disputes, civil judgments. But if it had to do with capital crimes, murder, and so forth, you had to have the minimum, the courts of 23. What was the calculation of 23? Why 23? We know an odd number. Why 23? Why not 3? Why not 7? Why not 5? Why not 11? The answer to this is very interesting. The Mishnah explains this in Tractate Sanhedrin. The Pasuk says, in Maseh, the end of Numbers, V'shaftu ha'eda v'hitzilu ha'eda. The community shall judge and the community shall rescue. Meaning, when somebody is brought to court, the responsibility of the court, which is called an Eda, a community, is to judge. But if all possible methods are employed in order to rescue the person, in order to save the person. A capital punishment to be given was extremely, extremely difficult. As our sages famously say, that a Sanhedrin that executes somebody even once in 70 years are called chavlonin, they're called damagers or terrorists. In other words, the Jewish courts tried to stay far, far away from giving the ultimate punishment of death. Of course, if they could find grounds for it. Eda in Chumash, Eda is minimum 10 people. Eda is a community, a congregation. We learned this out from various psukim. Ad Mosai le'eda hara hazois, Hashem says about the spies. How long will I have to deal with this evil community? There were 10 spies who dissuaded the Jewish people from going into the land. Eda is 10. This means, it says, v'hitzilu ha'eda. The community shall try to rescue the defendant. That means you have to have at least 10 judges, according to Jewish law, who should potentially be involved in trying to acquit this person from punishment. So you have 10 defenders. If you have 10 defenders, you always have to have 10 defenders, 10 potential defenders. So you have to have at least the same amount of people who potentially are prosecuting the person. Because if not, you don't have any two sides. So if you have 10 v'hitzilu, so you have Eda mechzakin and Eda mechayven. 10 people who will stand up to defend the person, but you have to be able to have a balance. So that means the court has to have another 10 people, so it should be even, to be able to prosecute. So now you're left with 20. You can't have 20 because then a stalemate, so you need 21. The problem with 21 is as follows. In order to try somebody with a capital case, the Torah says, you can't have one majority. The majority has to be at least 2. So if you have 10 defenders and you have 10 prosecutors, now you go to one person and you say, what do you say? This person has to decide the vote. Even if he says guilty, you can't try the person because you have to have a majority of 2, not of 1. So if you have 10 versus 11, the person will not be killed. It's not enough. You need to have minimum 10 versus 12. That means you have to go to 22. The problem with 22 is it's an even number. So it could work, but it could also not work. I mean, you can have 15 versus 7. It can work. You can have 20 versus 2. You can have 21 versus 1. But it can also not work. And if it doesn't work, you're stuck. So you have to add one more, 23. That's how they got the number of 23. So again, the Torah says, V'hitzilu ha'eda. We want at least there should be a potential of 10 judges defending. If 10 defenders, so you can't have a court of 11 people. Because if you want 10 defenders, then there's never going to be a situation where any person could be prosecuted or punished. So you have to have 10. 10. You can't have one more because we said you need a majority of 2. You can't have 22 because it's odd, so you had 23 because it's even, so you had to have 23. This was the number of the courts in every single city that tried all cases, including the most serious of capital cases. There were a few scenarios and situations that had to take up to Jerusalem to the Supreme Court, as lahavdil in other countries as well, when the federal courts in each state can't deal with it, or for whatever reason, it can be appealed and brought ultimately to the Supreme Court justices who will make the ultimate decision according to their understanding of the Constitution of the United States of America, and so in many other countries. Comes the Gemara, Reb Kahana, and teaches us a fascinating law. What happens if they all say guilty? It's not 22 say guilty. 22 say guilty and one says innocent. We follow the majority. If 10 say guilty and 10 say innocent and 13 say guilty, we follow the majority. Even if you have 11 who say innocent, but then you'll have 12 that say guilty, that wouldn't work. Why? Because as we said, you have to have 2 more, not 1 more. Okay, fine. So it's clear. It's not enough to execute somebody when you have a majority of 1. You need a majority of at least 2. What happens, asks the Gemara, if everybody says guilty? Sanhedrin Shiro Kulan L'chayva. The court case begins, they take a vote, and the vote turns out everybody said this person is guilty. Says Reb Kahana, poitrinois. He's acquitted. Which at the surface seems to make absolutely no sense. If 22 people said guilty and 1 person said innocent, nobody will say acquit him. This is the law, achrei rabim lahatos. You follow the majority. As in many other countries, in the case when you have judges or you have a jury, by the way, the number of a grand jury, 23, comes from the Sanhedrin, by the way. The number of a grand jury, 23, I think, comes from the Sanhedrin. It follows the majority, and that's what the Torah dictates as well. Torah understands that whenever you have people debating a situation, you're going to have different opinions, you're going to have different perspectives. You have to have a mechanism by which to reach a conclusion. You can't expect everybody to agree because human brains, human minds are different. Ein Yesei and Shabbos, people think differently. So you need a mechanism of how to deal with debate. If you don't have a mechanism how to deal with debate, you're either living in paradise or you're living in a dangerous dictatorship. That's the difference. And dictatorships are not paradises, even though the dictators call them paradises. But a country, a healthy country is a country, a healthy family, a healthy marriage, a healthy community, is where there's a mechanism of how to deal with disputations. Because that is part of the fabric of life. If somebody says, somebody once told me they were getting married and says, I'm going into a marriage, there's never going to be an argument in my home. There's never going. So if you could manage that, either you're in paradise or you're in a dictatorship. Somebody once said, I love all colors as long as they're blue. So that works. But in a dynamic where there's human beings, there's different perspectives. So the Torah puts that into place and says, achrei rabim lahatos. Granted. So if 22 say guilty and 1 says innocent, we follow them guilty. If it's the other way around, 22 say innocent and 1 says guilty, of course the person is exonerated and acquitted. And by the way, when it comes to the innocent side, you could have by majority of 1. So therefore, if you have, for example, 12 people saying innocent and 11 people saying guilty, what's the halacha? The halacha is the person is exonerated. Lo yisiya achrei rabim l'royos, the pasuk says in Mishpatim. When it comes to the penalty, to the punishment, you need the majority of 2 at least. But what would be the logic? If 22 say guilty and 1 says innocent, the person is tried and found guilty. Would it make sense then that if every member of the court voted guilty, every member of the grand jury, this grand Sanhedrin, let's call it, not jury, the grand Sanhedrin said guilty, of course the person should be seen as guilty. And the reason Reb Kahana gives is because they had to always delay it a night to see if anybody could come up with arguments for the defense. And here nobody's going to come up with arguments. Okay, nobody's going to come up with arguments. They all said guilty. I'm going to quote to you the law the way the Rambam, the great codifier of Jewish law, Maimonides, who lived in the 12th century, in the 1100s, how he puts it in his laws of Sanhedrin. Hilchos Sanhedrin, the laws of Jewish courts, Perek Tes, chapter 9. Sanhedrin sheposchu kulam b'dinei nefashos tchila. If you're dealing with a capital crime, meaning you're dealing with a potential death penalty, and the entire court opens up, v'amru kulon chayav, and everybody said, guilty, this man or woman should be killed, hareza potter, this person is exempt. This person is acquitted. At sheyiyu sham miktsas mezakin, sheyahapchu b'schusay. Until you have at least a few defenders who are tending or are gravitating towards his or her defense. V'yirbu hamechayven, and yet the prosecutors should exceed the defenders. V'achakach yaharig. Only then can capital punishment be brought against this person. This is such a strange halacha that throughout history there were various critics of Jewish law who brought this law as a demonstration, as a proof of the futility and the irrationality of the Jewish system of law. Who can make sense of this? To the contrary, if everybody says guilty, it means this man is such a criminal. Nobody even has a question. Nobody even has a doubt. There's no argument. Sometimes you can debate something, but some things you can't debate. If anything, we should say this person should be tried faster, swifter. It's obvious. 23 people, nobody has anything good to say. Person is certainly guilty. And yet the halacha comes and says the exact opposite. And here there's an interesting question that the Or HaChaim brings up in Parshas Mishpatim. Imagine you're sitting on the court. Now, the qualifications to sit on a Jewish court on the Sanhedrin were very, very taxing. They couldn't just take any Tom, Dick, and Harry and put them in a Sanhedrin. First of all, the scholarship of the person had to be extraordinary. The person had to be truly, truly fluent and knowledgeable in all of the details and foundations and intricacies of halacha, of Jewish law. In addition to that, the person had to be ordained ish mipiyish ad Moshe Rabbeinu. The person couldn't only be scholarly, the person had to be chosen and ordained literally, what they called smicha. Smicha means, they still call it smicha, but today it's already more symbolic. Smicha literally means to lean, to support. A Rebbe would take his two hands and place them on the body of his pupil and disciple, and with that, so to speak, confer upon him the authority and the responsibility to continue the chain of tradition the way he was once upon a time supported by his teacher, person to person to person, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, who did this to 70 people. So the smicha literally was like a living, vibrant, dynamic organism where you felt the burden, responsibility, and intense ecstasy of the power of Jewish history, literally from its first teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu. So when this person received smicha, his teacher, who had to be ordained from somebody, who was ordained from somebody, who was ordained from somebody, who was ordained from somebody, till Moshe Rabbeinu knew that this person is qualified intellectually and qualified emotionally and practically. And the fascinating thing is, we have all the names. In other words, Jewish history has been chronicled so effectively that we know who ordained who from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way down. The Rambam, Maimonides, in his introduction to his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, goes through from Moshe Rabbeinu, who he ordained Yehoshua, and who Yehoshua ordained, all the way to Rav Ashi, who lived in the 5th and 6th century after the Common Era, which means a half a millennium after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, all the way down, each generation, who was ordained by whom. At some point, that ended. That type of smicha ended. They did not have the ability to have that Sanhedrin anymore. And today what we call smicha, therefore, doesn't give a rabbi the power to try capital cases, and even much less than capital cases, what's called knossim, and even capital punishments. The Sanhedrin stopped before the destruction of the Second Temple because they didn't have the infrastructure that allowed them to act freely. They were under Roman occupation and under constant terror. So 40 years before the destruction of the Second Beis HaMikdash, they already stopped judging any capital cases. What we call today smicha is more of a symbolic idea of somebody who learned halacha and was ordained by a rabbi with the qualification of paskening in certain areas of Jewish law. Now, in addition to the knowledge and the qualifications, the key issue was, of course, the person's yirah shamayim, the person's fear of heaven, their commitment to integrity and truth, and above all, their humility. Because with arrogance and pompousness, truth and integrity is always undermined because it could become about me rather than about the truth, and that is always the most dangerous thing when it seeps into a court, when a leader, a rabbi, a teacher, a scholar, a posek, a dayan, a judge is ultimately driven by insecurity or by fear or by other agendas other than the truth. Obviously the disasters are quite clear. The consequences are quite clear. Say you were sitting on a court and they're taking a vote about this person. 1 guilty, 2 guilty. Hands. Guilty, raise your hand. 22 people said guilty. You're number 23. You believe the person is guilty. You know, if you say what you believe, what's going to be, how's going to happen? You're exonerating him. So what might you think to do? Say innocent. If you say innocent, they'll start screaming at you. How could you? And you'll say he's innocent. And you know what? The person will be penalized. This would be a logical thought, but the Torah prohibits it because it's a perversion of integrity. The pasuk is a pasuk in Mishpatim, the way the Arachayim explains this. Anybody has a chumash by any chance? You have a chumash? Parshas Mishpatim? Can I trouble you for one of those blue books right behind you? Right there. You see a blue sefer, a chumash? You're looking at it, no? Okay, it's fine. Oh, thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it. The pasuk says, "Lo isiya achrei rabim leroyos v'lo isana al riv lintois achrei rabim lahatois." The Arachayim HaKadosh explains that it's referring to this situation. The Torah absolutely prohibits this type of thinking. Ki hamishpat le'elokim, the Torah says justice ultimately belongs to God. If you believe the person is guilty, you have to say what you believe. If this is what you really believe, let the outcome be decided by God. Because if this is a genuine Torah court, ultimately you are conduits for the divine will to be implemented. Don't interfere with your own agendas and calculations where it's out of place and it's a perversion of integrity, a perversion of justice. But we're still left with our great dilemma. How do we make sense out of this halacha? How do we make sense out of this law? I'm going to present to you today two different interpretations, two different explanations, to just demonstrate how serious this question is. It'll be demonstrated by one point, and that is that some of the commentators, including a great one like the Meiri, who lived in 13th century in France, Rabbeinu Menachem HaMeiri, 13th and 14th century, says, Poitrin oisai doesn't mean you exempt him to go free. He says, Poitrin oisai miyad lemisa. Poitrin oisai means you send him right off to receive the death penalty. In other words, he is ready to completely change the normal meaning of the word poitrin, potter, which means exempt, to say it can't mean here you exempt a person. It just doesn't make sense. 23 people said this man is guilty. Or better, 71 people said he's guilty. If it came all the way to the Supreme Court, you can have 71 people said he's guilty. How do you let him go? Poitrin oisai means, according to the Meiri, you send him straight off to death, like you just get rid of him, so to speak. Potter in the sense, like you say, potter gevarin. Ich bin potter gevarin, I got rid of it. So it could mean I was exempt. Ich bin potter gevarin. Father of a mitzvah baruch makes a blessing. Baruch shepatrani. Me'oinish halozeh. Thank God you have exempted me from this burden. A mother never makes that blessing, as some of you know very, very well. Even when he's 72 years old, still under your responsibility and care, and you still worry. That's the main thing. The father at the age 13 stops worrying. Some of them stop worrying at 2. Baruch shepatrani, not all. Some are very worried as much as their wives and even more. So the idea of potter could mean exempt as you're exempt, you're acquitted, or potter as you get rid of, which also means like you dismiss it. Poitrin oisai means you dismiss him right away to death, not you dismiss him to the free world. Of course, it's very, very difficult to impose this interpretation, especially in the Rambam, who's writing a halachic, clear text. He says in his introduction, B'loshen brura, I'm writing in a clear language a child can understand, an adult can understand. How do you use a word poitrin, which everywhere means you dismiss the case, and here it means you dismiss the person to death. But I'm just showing to you, I'm trying to demonstrate what a difficult time many of the commentators had with this halacha. They said it can't be you exempt him. It has to be you send him right off to death. Don't delay it. There's no reason to delay it. Don't sleep over it. Don't think about it. Don't deliberate. There's nothing to do. Everybody said guilty. Obviously, this guy is guilty. Sadly, just do what you got to do and let's move on. But yet, it's very, very difficult to put this into the words poitrin oisai, which means you dismiss him, you exempt him. I should just clarify one thing. If you're dealing with a murderer, who say a serial killer, and 71 people say this man is a murderer because the evidence is just, maybe they don't even need witnesses. Maybe the witnesses are in the thousands in the sense that so many people saw it. Nobody would say you just let him go free to continue his heinous acts. Sometimes you have to incarcerate him. Sometimes you have to imprison him. Now, prison wasn't an official punishment in Judaism. It's fascinating that from all the penalties in Judaism, there's no punishment of prison in Torah. There's lashes, there's sacrifices, there was a death penalty, very rare, but there was a death penalty. There's, of course, compensation, financial compensation, very common. That's the greatest penalty. Sometimes double, 4 times, 5 times. Nezek, tsar, ripu, shavas, boishas. There's no penalty of prison in Judaism. As a independent, long-standing penalty. You could put somebody in prison to guard them, to protect them, or you don't want them to escape, but not as a punishment. 27 years, 10 years, 3 years, 4 years. Didn't exist in Yiddishkeit. You have to understand what would be the reason for that. But this is not part of the Jewish way of penalties. The reason is because penalty has to be about rehabilitation, not about vengeance. And prison just limits a person's capabilities, doesn't allow them to fulfill their mission in the world in a free way. So the point here being that maybe they would have to arrest this person if he's a danger, but they couldn't kill him because of this verdict. Maybe he'll do another act and be tried again by the court, and then not everybody will find him guilty. That may happen. But this situation, they can't execute him. So we're going to give two interpretations today. The first interpretation comes from a 16th century Turkish rabbi. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Halevi. He wrote a sefer called Chazdei Avos. And it's quoted in a famous commentary on Pirkei Avos, Medrash Shmuel, on Pirkei Avos, who quotes this interpretation by Rabbi Shlomo Halevi, the Chazdei Avos of the 16th century. He lived in the 1500s in Turkey. And he gives a very beautiful interpretation, and it could be proven from a fascinating focus on the nuance of the text. If you remember the opening of the class, I quoted the Gemara. Reb Kahana said, his language was, if you have a Sanhedrin, She, Amar Reb Kahana, Sanhedrin Shero Kulon Lechayva. The entire Sanhedrin saw this person as guilty. They gave a verdict of guilty. Makes sense. The Rambam, quoting the same halacha from this Gemara, puts in a word. Sanhedrin Shepaschu Kulam Bedine Nefashas Tchila. A Sanhedrin that unanimously all opened up a capital case, and they all said guilty. He puts in the word paschu kulan. They all opened up the case with a verdict guilty. And what the Medrash Shmuel and the Chazdei Avos explain here is that the Rambam is trying to clarify the halacha. The problem here is there was no debate. There was no discussion. There was no conversation. Sanhedrin Shepaschu. The case opens up. The leader of the court says, order in the court, here's the situation, here is the defendant, here are the witnesses. And the opening of the case was nothing to talk about. Guilty. He should be killed. That's when Poitrinois are you exempt. Why? Because there was no conversation. There was no debate. Had the Sanhedrin debated it, which is what they used to do, they would bring up this case. There were witnesses. They would split up. Everybody would try to convince his colleague, and they could sit on it for hours, a whole day, or whatever the situation was, and debate it back and forth. And then everybody said guilty at the end. Then, from the Rambam, it would seem you would punish this person. The problem is paschu kulam. They opened up the court case and they said guilty. There was no other perspective. There was no other side. There was no conversation. There was no discussion. What would be the problem in this? The problem in this is that truth can only be determined when you can hear two sides of an argument. The Gemara says that there were two schools of thought in Judaism known as Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. These were schools of thought who debated hundreds of cases in Yiddishkeit. Who does the halacha usually follow? Beis Hillel. Why? Because the courts took the votes and the majority followed Beis Hillel. But the Gemara in Eruvin 13 asks, why is this? Why is it that Beis Hillel triumphed in most cases? And the Gemara answers, the reason is mipnei shanoichin va'aluvin hayu. The school of Shammai actually produced sharper minds. But the school of Shammai produced sharper minds. Mechadeti tfei, they were sharper. But Beis Hillel, noichin va'aluvin hayu. They were calmer, they were more dignified and more respectful, and they were more empathetic to the other position and more sensitive. And not only that, when discussing the issue, they would always give preference to their opponent's view. They would first quote Beis Shammai's view and then their own view. They would let Beis Shammai speak first, and they would quote them first when they were saying it over, and then they would say their position. Which you see something very interesting. If you ever listen to your sons learning Mishnayos, you will hear that throughout Mishnayos, whenever there's an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, first the view of Beis Shammai is quoted, and then the view of Beis Hillel. That's curious because the editor of the Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who was a grandson of Hillel. So you would think that simply to honor his own father and grandfather and great-grandfather, he should quote the position of his ancestors first in Mishnayos. Divrei Beis Hillel and then Divrei Beis Shammai, especially that the halacha usually follows Beis Hillel. Why does he always, non-failingly, quote Beis Shammai first? That's what the Gemara says. This was a virtue of Beis Hillel. They would always give preference to Beis Shammai first, and that's why the halacha is like them. Now, there's something disturbing about this. I could understand that if somebody is more refined and more elegant and more dignified and more humble and more empathetic, and they give preference to their opponent's view, it's a virtue in humility. It's a virtue in character. But why does that dictate the position of halacha? Why does it make the halacha to follow Beis Hillel? Halacha should be followed by the mind that produces the greater truism. The mind that is sharper, the mind that is clearer, the mind that is more decisive, the mind that is more penetrating, the mind that is more keen. Why does halacha, why does the law follow the view of those people who were nicer? They were nicer, they were kinder. When it comes to a shidduch, I get it. When it comes to halacha, isn't it about intellectual prowess? Who is saying a better idea? Okay, he says good morning. He's very polite. He lets me speak first. Beautiful. He's a great, humble person. Why is that the determining factor in who gets the verdict? Why should the halacha follow Beis Hillel just because they let Beis Shammai speak first? You say something beautiful, but shouldn't the law follow that which is intellectually more true? No? If you were a judge, right? And you had two lawyers, right? One lawyer was very soft-spoken, and he always smiled, and he gave tremendous respect to the other lawyer. And he was a very nice person, and he had a wonderful reputation. The other lawyer was tough, rough, aggressive, not as polite. But one lawyer's argument, even though he was a very polite guy, his argument was really weak. And the other lawyer had substance, and you were the judge. Would you say, he's a nice lawyer, we have to follow his verdict? Of course not, right? That would be corruption of justice. When it comes to a shidduch, you get it? And yet the Gemara says, Beis Hillel was nice and pleasant and let Beis Shammai speak first. This is not such a feminine question, huh? It's a masculine question, right? But it's a good question. They let Beis Shammai speak first. Beautiful. So why does the judge say, okay, so the verdict is like Beis Hillel because they were nicer? It's a little difficult to understand. It's actually very difficult to understand. So the Shoyal Omeshiv, the Rav of Lvuv, Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natanson, Divrei Shaul on Gemara, he gives a fabulous explanation. He says this wasn't just a virtue of character. This was an intellectual virtue in terms of reaching the truth of the verdict. Because the only way you can really ascertain whether your ideas are genuine and deep is if you consider your opponent's views. If I develop a certain opinion, how do I know that this is a genuine opinion? Or maybe it's just indoctrination. Maybe I'm just narrow-minded. Maybe I'm just so subjective and primitive. I never opened myself up to anything else. Such a person welcomes the opposite opinion and says, wow, that's so interesting. And now it allows me to consider all of the angles, all of the perspectives. So when I reach my conclusion, it's much more thorough. It's much more authentic. It's much more genuine. It's much more deep. It's not coming from fear and narrow-mindedness and insecurity. How many people live their entire lives? They have deep, deep ingrained ideas and perspectives and philosophies. They sometimes get very, very passionate about it. But never once in their life did they allow anybody to challenge anything they believe in or anything they hold dear or any conviction of theirs. And if somebody does it, they immediately have names for that particular person to make sure that this person stays far, far away, and I could feel confident with everything I believe about this one or that one, and I'm never, ever, ever challenged, and I still feel I'm intellectually righteous. But if you would sit down for a 5-minute conversation with somebody who may open you up to another view, you're like, ooh. So in many ways, it's much easier to avoid that. But that's not the quality of intellectual integrity. That's the quality of insecurity. That's the quality of primitiveness. That's the quality of indoctrination. How often is it that sometimes Jews who grew up in a particular Weltanschauung, a particular neighborhood or particular community or particular mahalach, and when they just hear the name of another community or another group of Jews, it right away conjures so many stereotypes. Did they ever find out? Did they ever discover? Did they ever inquire? Did they ever search? Did they ever open themselves up? Where does the judgmentalism come from? It comes from blind indoctrination over years and decades and sometimes centuries. And the main thing is, I have to tell myself that I'm a true person, so I give myself intellectual and spiritual justifications for my narrow-mindedness. And that is, talking to this person is always dangerous. Of course, he might make sense. So Beis Hillel's power was that they allowed Beis Shammai to speak first. It wasn't just about their politeness. It allowed their views to be much more powerful. Because they always considered their opponent's view. They thought it through. They thought about it. They reflected on it. Their horizons were expansive. And therefore their positions in life encompassed all of reality. If Torah is based on emes, emes can't be afraid of reality. If truth is afraid of reality, it has nothing to do with truth. That's what you call cults, falsehood. Reality contributes to truth. Reality doesn't take you away from truth unless it's not true. Unless it's just an illusion. It's a perception, it's a delusion. You're living in a world of hallucinations. Then reality contradicts it. You stay far, far away from reality. Beis Hillel wanted to hear everything they say. You speak first. I'm not afraid. Speak first. They were pleasantly sensitive and empathetic to the other view. It allowed them to develop views that were expansive, that were deep, that could encompass the other position. And that's why the halacha follows like Beis Hillel. You understand? There are a few Jewish couples in the world that sometimes get into a disagreement. How do you deal with disagreement? How do you deal with somebody disagreeing with you? How? One way is you get very, very defensive. You get very, very aggressive. You either run or you crush. But there's a much deeper way of dealing with it, and that is opening yourself up to the expansiveness of your horizons. So the next time your spouse disagrees with you, take a deep breath and say, wow, what a great opportunity to expand my horizons. No, he's an idiot. The guy is clueless. He's out for lunch. What horizons? When horizons? There's no horizons. There's idiocy. Indeed, one has to have the sobriety and the common sense to distinguish between opinions that are coming from strength and opinions that are coming from weakness, and even then appreciate the fact that these opinions are coming from weaknesses that have to be addressed. But the point is that disagreements are not negative, they're not evil, they're essential to the enrichment of the human spirit intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. This was the power of the court. The halacha was not based on, okay, he's guilty. The problem is poschu kulam. Right away guilty. There's no conversation. There's nothing to talk about. Let's hear. Let's bring up the stuff. Let's hear. Let's fight about it. Let's explore it from all angles. No, we're anyway going to come to that conclusion. When we come to that conclusion, we'll come to that conclusion. If they all come to that conclusion after conversation, after discussion, after debate, that's fine. That's why the Rambam changes to Sanhedrin, shepaschu kulam. The problem was, mat nish gehert, mat nish geret. Boom, 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 this is what it is. It's almost like we're not trusting the culture of debate and conversation and argument that is essential to Judaism. It's not just a nice thing. It's essential to Judaism because it's essential to truth. That's why the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, Kol machlokas shi l'shem shamayim sofer l'skayim. V'she'ena l'shem shamayim ein sofer l'skayim. An argument for the sake of heaven will endure. An argument not for the sake of heaven won't endure. What does this mean? So you know the hubris interpretation. An argument for the sake of heaven, meaning whenever in an argument you bring in God, it's going to last forever. If it's an argument that's not about God, then they ain't sofer l'skayim, then you can make a compromise. You know, tell me you're fighting about money, no problem. The moment people say it's not me, you know when somebody says it's not personal, it's the principle. Oh my God. If it's the principle, how can I compromise? I'm defending God. The moment God comes into the picture, it becomes very, very dangerous because it may just be your toxicity and your pompous self-centeredness, narcissistic ego. But for you, God has become your ego. You don't know of a God outside of your ego. My ego equals God, or rather, God equals my ego. My ego is holy. Such machloikas and last forever. And sometimes people live their whole lives in the shell, in a bubble, with such self-righteousness and such indignation of other positions. And they have this comfortable smile on their faces and this feeling that they have touched truth. They never sat at a table with one person who had a different, substantially different perspective and opened themselves up to it. It's right away boxed in responses and refutations with the ultimate great redeeming word, kfira. The moment I could say it's kfira, it's heresy, it's great, you're the demon, I'm the angel, and you are persona non grata. Either you're a meshugana or you're a koifer, and the main thing is my brainwashing indoctrination can continue to flourish in my own narrow comfort zone, which I pathetically call truth. Sanhedrin shepaschu kulam l'chayva. What's the psicha l'chayva? We have to hear, what is the other side? What is the other side? Is there another side? Let somebody discuss this. Let's explore it. What is this idea of a machlokes for the sake of heaven? So Rabbeinu HaMeiri gives a powerful interpretation. He says, an argument for the sake of heaven is an argument focused on truth. An argument not for the sake of heaven is an argument for the sake of power. There are two types of arguments in the world, in life. There's an argument where I'm looking for truth and you're looking for truth. There's an argument where I'm looking to be right and you're looking to be right. What's the difference? Machloikes she l'shem shamayim, sofer l'skayim. A machloikes, a conflict, a debate, a disagreement. where both sides are looking for the truth, soifa lehiskayim, it will endure. What will endure? Both sides will endure. Machloikas she'ein l'shem shamayim. If it's a machloikas not for the truth, it's about I need to be right or I want to be right or about my power, then ein soifa lehiskayim. None of the sides will be right. Why? You understand why? So I'll explain it to you. You have to think about this. There's only one type of argument where defeat is victory. Which type of argument is an argument where defeat is also victory? No, there's an argument, but an argument where the defeat is also victory. I'm defeated. I lost, but I won. If it's an argument about truth, if I was looking for the truth, and then I realized that the truth is on the other side, so to speak, my defeat is also a victory. Because I was looking for the truth. What about if I'm not looking for the truth? If I'm looking to win, if I need to be right, I don't care about the truth. I need to be right. I need to win. It's about my power, my honor, my insecurity, my thing. I'm not looking for emes. It's about me winning. Here, even if I win, I'm defeated. Here, victory is defeat. You know why? Because what did my winning accomplish? It diminished the other person. It diminished the other person, and as a result, it diminished me too. It diminished me, and it diminished my relationship to truth. Both sides endure. Even the losing side, even the one who was defeated endures. Why? Because he or she was defeated by truth. Defeat by truth is victory. If that's what you're looking for. If you're not looking for that, then of course it's a defeat. I lost. But if it's a machloikas she'ein l'shem shamayim, ein soifa lehiskayim. No position endures. Even the one who's right also loses. If I win, if I win, I lost. And if you win, you also lost. For me to win, you have to win. And for you to win, I also have to win. One of the greatest challenges in a marriage, any relationship, is this, where the arguments are never about what is truth, what will benefit the reality of the home, of the relationship, of the children, of the family. It's about who's going to prove to be right, who's going to win. So who wins? I ask you, who wins? Nobody. Everybody loses. Even the person who won lost. The person who lost, and even the person who won lost. The moment you get intoxicated by that, or the moment you get swallowed up into that orbit, everybody loses. You have to be able to step away. And it's not so easy because I may have a lot of anger, and I may have a lot of resistance, and I may have a lot of sadness, and I may have a lot of pain. And that clouds everything. And I have to be able to acknowledge that. And then when I acknowledge that, I can also step away from it in the sense that it doesn't dominate me. And that's why the main feature of a Sanhedrin, to be able to be accepted as the real court of law, that God puts a stamp on it and says, this is emes, Moshe emes v'Torah emes, this is the din Torah dvar Hashem zu halacha, is when there is machloikas, l'shem shamayim. The problem here is, there was no machloikas. The greatness of Beis Hillel was, they asked Beis Shammai, what do you have to say? I don't want to say what I have to say before what you have to say. I once heard from a very, very successful CEO of a huge corporation, and he said, you know, a lot of CEOs make a mistake. They'll make a board meeting of the members of the board, the team. the board of directors or the management, whatever the team is, and they say, what do you have to say? 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 But their focus is let everybody say what they have to say. And then I'm the boss. I'll say what I have to say and we'll move on. So why do you have to let everybody say what they have to say? It's just protocol. You don't want to come across as a tyrant. So you don't just come in and say, okay, guys, I couldn't care less about you. Here's the rule. This is what we're doing. Yeah, what do you say? What do you say? Checks his phone 20 times in the middle. Okay, this is what we're going to do. And in that, he lost his greatest opportunity. And his greatest opportunity was the opportunity to listen. To actually listen. Not to speak, but to listen. To listen to what this person says, and what this person says, and what this person says. And when you really, really listen, you're enriched far more than when you speak, as I know from experience. Okay, that didn't go over well. That's why it says in Shema, V'haya'im Shamoya Tishmon. Why twice? You ever thought about this? What's wrong if we say V'haya'im Shamoya? V'haya'im Tishmu al mitzvaysai. Tishmu means you listen. What's V'haya'im Shamoya? Tishmu al mitzvaysai. V'haya'im Tishmu al mitzvaysai. Asher noichim mitzavah eschem hayom la'ava. What Moshe Rabbeinu is saying is there's listening, and then there's really listening. V'haya'im Shamoya Tishmon. If you're going to listen, I mean really listen. Not just listen so that the other person should be able to finish so you could prove them wrong. Not just listen so you could be perceived as a polite person who allowed your opponent to speak. Not just listen so that your children shouldn't say you're a terrible mother. V'hayim Shemaya Tishmun, if you'll truly, truly listen. If you'll stop everything, put everything down, and really, really become attentive, really lend your ear and listen. Not just listen to the words, listen to the silence. Not just listen to the words, listen to the pauses. Not just listen to the pauses and the silence, listen to that which is unspoken. Not just listen, but also watch and observe the gestures, the body language. Really listen in full attentiveness to the person. It's one of the greatest gifts you can give somebody you cherish. It's hard today because most people come into meetings and conversations with their phones. And when a person is speaking, especially if you know that they're going to go on for a while, it's a great time to answer texts, to respond to emails, to buy buildings, to sell buildings, to plan the end of your summer vacation, to plan sukkahs, and to start buying food for Hanukkah. But the art of listening really is suspension of everything else to truly listen. The problem in this court case is there was no listening. Everybody right away had an opinion. Chayva, his Torah says, I'm sorry. Truth cannot come out from this. We need epis debate. Comes the Maharitz Chiyus. Reb Tzvi Chiyus was one of the great Galicianer Polish rabbis who lived in the 19th century, in the 1800s. He wrote a very famous commentary called Mevoy HaTalmud, Introduction to Talmud, and he has a commentary on Gemara. And in his commentary to Tractate Sanhedrin 17, Reb Tzvi Chayes, Maratz Chiyus, or Maratz Chayes, adds another dimension. And this is what he says. He says that from a Torah perspective, there's no such a thing that you can't find an angle of innocence. This doesn't exist. Maybe the majority ultimately will give the verdict guilty. But the fact that an entire Sanhedrin could sit down and not one individual could come up with any rationale, even as a havamin, even as a point of contention, as a point of debate, to acquit the person, the Torah says there's something off. This court case is a blemish. It's invalid. Why? Says the Maratz Chiyus, what the sages were teaching is that there's no person and circumstance and situation in the world where that does not lend itself to some form of defense. This doesn't mean that this form of defense ultimately must prove as the decisive factor in truth and decide the verdict. But it means it has to be explored. It has to be brought to the fore. Whether it's trauma, whether it's a background of a person, whether it's mishagas, insanity, whether it's bitterness, whether it's horrific pain, whether it's horrific circumstances, whether it's complete misjudgment, whether it's indoctrination, whether it's a person who wasn't given a chance to learn about any self-value, whether it's a person with a serious internal condition, whatever it may be. But if it's a person, and a person was created, B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God, there's always something to say about the defense, even if it's going to be rejected in the ultimate verdict. And the Ma'aretz Chiyus says, that's the logic of this argument. That when Sanhedrin all opens up l'chayva, and nobody had anything positive to say about this person, there's absolutely no defense. The Torah does not trust this court case. There's something missing here. There's something off. And it's not just that it's so important to explore that angle because it exists. It's essential to a court case. Because all the penalties in Yiddishkeit are never there just for vengeance or to score points or to get even with a person or to flex muscles or to show you who's the boss, coming out of anger and a loss of control. They're not even there to deter other people, even though that's also a fact of v'cholam yushmu v'yiro. The main function of every penalty in Torah is always rehabilitation. Sometimes there can't be rehabilitation in this world, that's true. Sometimes there's lashes, sometimes there's a sacrifice, sometimes there's a lot of monetary compensation. But the focus is always rehabilitation. Even Achan, who stole from the Chramim, Yeshua said not to steal when they came into Eretz Yisrael. And he was killed, and they said, Achurata boilam haza, says the Gemara, v'iyata achur loilam haba, Sanhedrin 44. You're rehabilitated in the next world. So the focus of every penalty always has to be, there is a goodness in you, but you have to be rehabilitated. When one member of the court says something good about the person, it allows all of those who say guilty to be accepted, their verdict to be accepted. Because it's against the backdrop of a core innocence. If the guilty doesn't come with a backdrop of core innocence, the Torah doesn't accept the guilty verdict. The guilty verdict always has to follow and has to come in context of at least one view who says innocent, because that view captures that there is an innocent, pure core, even if this life went sour and became corrupt as a result of various situations or choices or a combination, etc. But ultimately, that one view that says innocent because of X, Y, Z demonstrate that there's a good core. It's what allows all of the ones who say guilty to be accepted. Because it means not just guilty, you're a lost case because you're evil. But guilty because we agree with that one voice who says innocent. We also believe that there's a core goodness. We also believe in rehabilitation. But we feel, according to Torah, this is the right path. But it's against the backdrop of your goodness, always. So really, the side that says guilty, the side that says innocent, they're arguing in terms of what the penalty or should be or shouldn't be. But substantially, they're agreeing to the same truth. And that is, we all want to bring out the goodness of this person. Some say, he is so good, he's not even guilty, let him go. Some say, no, he has to be punished. But they all agree there's a goodness that we want to get back at. But if nobody has anything good to say, if nobody could bring out that core goodness, if it can't be manifested in the court, nobody could say, you know, this person is really, really good. This happened because of this, and this happened because of that, and this happened because of that. That means they're not catching on to that. They're not accessing it. The Torah says they cannot judge. They cannot judge this person. I have to always be able to get at that. One judge at least, two judges, a few judges have to be able to sit and say, I know this was wrong. Nobody argues that this was a horrible situation. The only question that we have to ask is, can we really look into this person and say that there's a goodness even in this person, even though their life has taken a very, very vicious turn, and they lost control, and they may have done something not just wrong, but heinously wrong. And it's true, we all know, in all of our interactions and relationships. Sometimes you look at a person, and you see certain things they have done or haven't done that caused harm to themselves or to others. And here the Maharatz Chiyas is giving a very powerful lesson. And that is, irrelevant of the decision of what the right thing to do is, part of the conversation has to always focus on one thing, the purity of the person. If that's not part of the conversation, the Torah does not include it. The stenographer, what do they call it? When you delete it, it's not it's not included in part of the court conversation. I have to be able to look at this person and be able to see them as a 2-year-old, as a 4-year-old. Sometimes you look at a child of yours, a nephew, a niece, a grandchild, a friend's child, or a stranger, and you see certain things they're doing, certain things they're not doing, certain things they're involved in. And it may be absolutely disastrous and wrong. And the path to take is not always simple and clear. What's the right thing to do? But part of that conversation always has to be, can you see the purity in that person's soul? Can you see the goodness somewhere? They may not be able to see it in them, but can you see it? Can you see that this person was once a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old, as innocent as an angel, as sweet as sugar, and as pure as the white snow? Can you see it? Can you see in them that sanctity? Can you see in them that thirst, that yearning, that holiness? Can you see the trauma? Can you see the pain? Can you see the horrors they endured? Can you see the wrong decisions that have been made? Can you see where things went wrong? This is not about justification, rationalization. It's not about moral relativism. It's not about denigrating. It's not about covering up for bad things at all. On the contrary, it's about finding a path to redemption. It's about finding a path to rehabilitation. What's the verdict? The verdict might be innocent. The verdict might be guilty. What that means practical, every situation, you have to know what that means for the best of that person and for the best of the situation. But it means that always I have to be able to get at that point, because without that, even the guilty verdict is not accepted in Yiddishkeit, because that means you're not in touch. You don't see the full picture. You're not taking the person into account. You're not dealing with the full, true reality of the situation, that there is a divine soul, a divine image that was badly, badly distorted. They say that there was once a court case, and the person who was brought in was the defendant was accused of murder. There was only one issue. There was no corpse. There was no dead body. Nobody could produce evidence of a corpse. But there was very strong evidence supporting that this person was killed by this person. Anyway, there was a grand jury and a long trial. And as the trial was coming to an end and the verdict was about to be announced, the lawyer defending the accused realized it seemed that the grand jury is going to find him guilty. So he decided to perform one last attempt. And as they're deliberating, the lawyer gets up and says, "You have been debating now for days and weeks whether my client is a murderer, if he murdered X, Y, and Z, or he's not. The grand jury is soon going to have to make a decision. There were witnesses this way and this way, proofs this way and this way, proofs this way and this way. And nothing is clear, but I'm going to clarify it. And that is, in 30 seconds, I want you to look at the door, the entrance to this courtroom. And you know who's going to walk in? The supposed corpse, the supposed victim of my client, the man who he supposedly murdered. He's going to walk in live and healthy into this courtroom, and this should settle the case." And he sits down. There's silence in the courtroom. You could sense the electricity and the suspense. And everybody lifts up their eyes and is staring. You can imagine staring at the door coming into the court. And 30 seconds pass, and 40 seconds pass, and 2 minutes pass. It's silent in the room, but nobody comes in. No man comes in, no woman comes in, no angel comes in, nobody comes in. No ghost comes in. And they kicked. After 5 minutes, the lawyer gets up and says, "It was just a trick. Nobody is coming in. But I want to show you something. You are all convinced that he murdered him. Why did every member of the grand jury look up to the door? In a few minutes, you're about to give a verdict that he's a murderer. You never saw the corpse, but you're all about to say he's a murderer. Why did you all look up at that door? If you would have known that that guy was dead, to the point that you're ready to execute my client, you wouldn't look up at the door. You all looked at that door. You are dishonest." A few minutes later, the judge comes back, gives a clap on the tish. What's the verdict? The judge says, "Guilty." Really? Guilty? Everybody thought that the lawyer just performed the greatest stunt of his life. This was a triple home run. It was something special. We call a grand slam. He hit it out of the park. The judge says, "Guilty." The lawyer says, "Your Honor, why?" And the judge says, "Everybody looked at the door besides one person. There was one person who didn't look at the door. And that is your client." Your client did not look up at that door. Because he knew nobody's coming in. That's why he's guilty. In Judaism, the moment you close all the doors and you can't see any light, you can't see any goodness, even not buried deep inside the soul, a goodness that is worth discussing, a goodness that can say, you know, he's really good, but, and therefore don't kill him. Because you're not dealing with all evil and blackness and darkness and negativity. If all the doors are closed, then you are not the authority. You are not capable of judging this person from the divine blueprint and perspective. Have a wonderful week. You're welcome. You're welcome.